I, Aditya from Historiologus, welcome you all to our second talk, Gender in Indian History, by very distinguished guest, Professor Charu Gupta ma'am, who is a senior professor at the Department of History, University of Delhi. With a robust academic background, ma'am has completed her PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London in 2000, after earning her MPhil and postgraduate degrees from the University of Delhi. Over her decades-long career, she has garnered several prestigious fellowships, including the Commonwealth Scholarship and the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library Fellowship, as well as numerous international recognitions from institutions such as University of Chicago and Rochelle University. A committed educator, Professor Gupta has been teaching at the University of Delhi since 1992 and has held prominent administrative role, including serving as teacher in charge of the History Department South Campus. Beyond her role at Delhi University, she has also been a visiting professor at the University of Vienna and guided numerous PhD and MPhil scholars through their academic journeys. Now, ma'am, you can begin. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. You can start.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope I'm audible. And I hope my screen is also, my PowerPoint is visible to all of you.
Yes, ma'am.
I always enjoy interacting with undergrad students, so it's a pleasure to be here. What I'm going to say today is not anything new. I'm sure many of you already know this. It is also coming from my larger work of the past 30 years. But what I'm trying to do here is give you a broad sense of the way in which the trends that have emerged, in the way in which gender has been looked at in Indian history. And my emphasis is going to be on modern India, since that is my field and that is an arena I am familiar with. So, gender is as much a political subject as an intellectual one. And more importantly, neither men nor women inhabit a single identity. We all know this. Their gendered lives overlap with their identities as subjects of a particular race, a class, a caste, or their regional affiliations, or their national identities. So today I'm going to draw on some examples from my research on histories of gender and sexuality. And my talk will underline the problems and possibilities of embodying gender in modern Indian history. So let me begin with a very brief review of historiography on questions of gender in modern India. So it is passé to say that, traditional Indian histories were largely written from a male perspective. But the trajectory of women in colonial India shows that their first historical accounts date mainly from the period of social reforms in the 19th century. Gender concerns erupted into the emergent Indian public sphere in this period to form a particularly busy and raucous arena. And though largely initiated by men, these kinds of debates, these gender debates, marked anxious debates around, gender questions. So most British colonial and missionary writings viewed the position of women in India before their advent as one of extreme degradation. So the condition of women in India became one of the principal means for the British Empire to justify its civilizing mission and to so-called reform what they perceived as depraved customs of India. And James Mill's work is a classic example of this, where he justifies British rule by saying that their rule is signifies a significant improvement in the condition of women. Now, what we see is that there was, of course, a response from nationalist history writings and reformist rhetoric. But what they are also doing is, like the Britishers, they are also following a positive teleology. And they also assumed this kind of an evolutionary advance in the condition of Indian women, that social reforms came, women's education came, and then women participated in Gandhian movements. And what they're doing is also they're juxtaposing, many of them are juxtaposing a supposedly glorious ancient past, and then they see a decline in the medieval period, and then they show this kind of social reforms, etc. So this is it's almost a linear view of history, where they too argued that social reforms, they led to emancipation of women from the stagnating condition in which they had been rotting. But what is the difference between Britishers and the nationalists is that they are saying that the reforms are a result of our efforts. They are not due to British initiatives. We forced Britishers to pass laws, against sati, in favor of widow remarriage. And it was largely our efforts that resulted in improving women's condition. So there is this uncritical adulation, and social reforms emerge as a really liberating force, because all this, abolition of sati, female education, widow remarriage, rise in age of consent is attributed to these kind of reforms. As I said, many of the Hindu nationalists also argued that Hindu women in ancient India exemplified learning, freedom, and mobility. And many of them claimed that such freedom had been lost, under centuries of Muslim rule, when supposedly Hindu womanhood was pushed into secluded domesticity for shelter against Muslim attacks. Now, late 19th century Indian Muslim opinion makers, they developed a counter argument about the relatively superior rights of their women, under pristine Islamic laws, which in their argument had been compromised by centuries of unhealthy Hindu influences. So both of the reformers are laying the blame on each other's shoulders. And reform movements largely came from religious backgrounds, in the sense that there were these Hindu reforms for Hindu women, and Muslims were projecting these reforms for Muslim women. And then there were scholars like Maulana Ashraf Ali Khan, for example, who declared that Islam expected Muslim women to be educated, pious, and efficient in order for them to be as proficient in Islamic theology as some men. So Hindu and Muslim versions of gender history, though mutually antagonistic, both of them are claiming an ideal past for their community, which interestingly they extrapolated from the status of their women. Now, such viewpoints actually offered a problematic perspective to describe changes in women's conditions. Because, for example, regarding social reforms, we need to keep in mind that most of the earlier initiatives were taken largely by men. Also, most of the reformers, whether Hindu reformers or Muslim reformers, they belong to elite classes, either to the Sharif communities or to upper castes. Many of them compromised with colonialism in many ways. They're also largely addressing problems of upper caste or middle class women. And also, many of them, are distancing themselves from syncretic and popular religious and cultural practices. So, for example, many of the Muslim reformers were not very taken, they were speaking against kind of Sufi ethos, etc. So, particularly in the context of women, we see that there is this kind of distancing from, popular religious and cultural practices. Also, if we extend this argument to nationalism, what we see is that while there has been this overwhelming study that with the coming of Gandhian nationalism, women were very much visible, which is very much true. But again, there were regional variations, there were caste variations, and we have to take into account consciousness, perceptions, along with actions. And how we see that even in Gandhian movements, women's participation was often perceived as a religious duty with the language of fasting and sacrifice. So, in many ways, there was simultaneously a strengthening of heteronormative patriarchy. And what I mean by this is that there was a privileging of heterosexual and conjugal relationships. There was subordination of women in general, in spite of many of the reforms. And there was also a stigmatization of non heterosexual bodies and desires in particular. Now, the 1980s marked a very important phase in gendered histories of modern India when, some remarkable books based on feminist historiography appeared. And of course, Recasting Woman has almost become this kind of a pioneering book, which many of the feminist historians now refer back to. And this had an amazing collection of articles, and it highlighted some of the historical processes which reconstituted patriarchy in colonial India. And the general editorial argument of the book was that basically reforms re imprisoned modern women into new cages of male desire. There were other collections also at this time, and there was this very good collection which was called Women in Colonial India, Essays on Survival, Work and the State, which was interesting. It did not have a central kind of argument, but what was good about this collection was that it was focusing on poor women, on factory workers, agricultural laborers, home-based production. It also talked about law courts, etc. So in some ways, the essays in this volume were examining new areas of experience and change in women's relations with modern institutions, labor forms, and political movements. And then finally, there was, of course, Geraldine Forbes' Women in Modern India, which was part of the Cambridge volumes. And that too put forward a women's history by privileging women's own accounts. But we need to remember that these books came out all in the 1980s. And since then, there have been many new developments, many new, very important anthologies and books that have come out. I particularly want to mention here there is a recent book, very recent book, which is edited by Lata Singh and Shashank Sinha, which is called Women in Modern India. There is also this very good book by Tanika Sarkar, which has just come out, which is Women and Religion, which is, and again, very, very good books which take forward actually or even problematize some of the arguments that were given in these earlier books. There was also my edited collection, called Gender in Modern India, and again, gendering colonial India, and that too had many essays which actually addressed some of the lacunae of these earlier books. So, for example, if I talk of Recasting Women, what we see is that while it was very, very important, the editors of the book themselves acknowledged that the essays in their volume were confined to the dominant Hindu community. Most of the essays were on North India or Bengal. They dealt mainly with middle class women and men. They also did not focus so much on questions of caste or, for example, questions of homosexuality or masculinity. So, so that was one of the limitations, and also the new books that are coming, while they are emphasizing that how patriarchies were recast in modern India, they also emphasize equally, if not more, how they were challenged, destabilized, and subverted in this time. Now, one more focus of gender histories has been that most of the time when we talk about gender histories, we are strongly focusing, or we are exclusively often focusing on experiences of women. So studies of gender with men and masculinity thrown in are fairly recent. But one of the earlier works, which did not, in that sense, address gender questions, but still Ashish Nandi's Intimate Enemy was an important book because it brought in a significant dimension to the relationship between gender and nation, even if not directly, because he hinted that, it is very important to study masculinity because, of course, masculinity is as vital for gender analysis as we study ruling classes when we do any class analysis. So, examining images and stereotypes, he pointed out the supposedly superior masculine British Empire, how it was contrasted to an effeminate colonial subject. And Nandi went on to argue that Gandhi actually subverted these notions by articulating that feminine was worthier and preferred. Actually, we see that there is quite a debate on masculinity as well, in this period, because everybody in some ways is working out different versions of masculinity, whether it is Vivekanand, whether it is Gandhi, whether it is Sanatan Dharmis, whether it is Arya Samajis. There is this kind of new emphasis on brahmacharya, and brahmacharya now is not just linked to celibate and being, controlling male sexuality. It is linked to service for the nation. You have to be, even Bhagat Singh is saying that, he's not going to get married because he wants to serve the nation. So there is a juxtaposition of, like if you get married, you cannot serve the nation. Or if you indulge in your sexual desires, you cannot serve the nation. So there is a new spin given to the notion of brahmacharya. For example, there is also this kind of new image of the warrior Krishna, and Sudipto Kaviraj has studied it as to how Bankim Chandra, for example, used this image of a warrior Krishna rather than the playful Krishna. So the Krishna of the Mahabharata becomes more important to talk of masculinity than the playful Krishna of the earlier period. So all this signifies changing constructions of masculinity in this period. There have, of course, been now significant works. Shikata Banerjee's work, for example, Make Me a Man. And then there is Mrilanali Sinha's work earlier, again, which brought in new aspects to studies on masculinity by pointing how gender historiography of colonial India has enriched, studies on masculinity. Discourses around masculinity also need to be critically linked to debates around homosexuality and same-sex love and desire in colonial India. So all the reformers and nationalists, when they're talking of masculinity also, it is very much within a heteronormative paradigm. So we need to actually look at studies of homosexuality as well. And there are very less works now. There are some very good recent works, like, for example, Anjali Arondekar's work on the archive is an important intervention in this arena. But otherwise, it's very difficult to actually get sources on questions of homosexuality and same-sex love in this period. Now, there have been critiques of work like of Nandi, and for example, Tarika Sarkar argues that while Nandi, critiques modern Western colonialism, and he shows that it was authoritarian, it introduced dehumanizing impulses. What Tanika Sarkar says is that at times Ashish Nandi also tends to celebrate the pre-colonial, indigenous, and traditional pasts as not only more tolerant, but their recovery is presented as the hope for the future. this has had important gender implications because many scholars have argued that the earlier period before the coming of colonialism was much more uh, fluid, and there was increasing conformity and marginalization of women's space and popular culture due to colonialism, modernity, enlightenment, while the earlier period had more flexible sexual codes. On a different register, even the works of scholars like Ruth Vanita have claimed that gay, lesbian, and transgender habits were widely practiced and tolerated in the pre-colonial era, but the colonial government, indicted and repressed them. Now, this is of course true. This is partially true, but I think all this, while true, presents only one side of the picture. What you also have to realize is that it is in modern India, it is in the colonial period that we really have some of the most important debates around gender. Also, the flourishing of print and public sphere reveals that there were internal challenges being offered at this time to suppression of women's spaces. There was new forms of bazaar literature. There were new ways in which women were expressing their sexuality, pleasure, love. They were participating first time in such mass movements, and because of that, I think they were pushing for their rights, even if in a very proto-feminist language and very early kind of feminist language. So various endeavors that are at this time trying to control women or trying to mold them in certain ways often had actually limited impact on ground, and we should not assume their all encompassing domination. For example, why were the reformers so anxious about how women were behaving? They were constantly telling women how to be good wives, how to be the ideal mother, what to read, what to eat, whom to talk to. And this perhaps implied the potential or actual recalcitrance of women. Also, I think in popular literature and culture, the prurient and the puritanical clashed and at times came together in complicated ways. So they enacted a reformist and patriarchal script, and at other moments they helped in reconstituting and delegitimizing conventional values. So colonial India possessed immensely heterogeneous experiences of gender, which actually pulled in contradictory directions. There is also, of course, the critical work of Partha Chatterjee. It is also quite old now, and that has also had an impact on the way in which we perceive the relationship between social reforms, nationalism, and women. And basically, his argument is that while the Indian male had lost out in the material public sphere, it was in the private inner domain where he could express his superiority, and the woman's body became a metaphor for that unviolated, chaste space and the last refuge of freedom. He also argues that the growth of the national movement in early 20th century uh, led to a co-option of the woman's question, and this to the larger political project pending achievements of other objectives. And while this is a persuasive argument, again there are limitations to this because most of his arguments actually pertain to Bengal, but there were regional variations. For example, my study of North India shows that actually reformist endeavors in the women's question did not fade away with the nationalist movement. In fact, they reached their peak precisely in the period coinciding with the nationalist fervor. Also, I think the private and the public could not be separated in this way because they were impinging on each other. They were constantly being debated, private issues were being debated in the public sphere. And most importantly, precisely when reforms centered on women seemed to largely disappear from the upper caste agenda, if we look at figures like Ambedkar and Periyar, and if we look at anti-caste movements, actually there is a new kind of emergence of woman as the central subject. There have also been subaltern historians who have contributed to gender historiography, but they have had an uneasy relationship with feminist historiographies. There is a very nice essay by Janaki Nair which talks about this. And, lots of feminists have interrogated the subaltern project while participating in the ongoing deliberations on the subaltern gender. And there is also this kind of new nuances that have been added. So, for example, uh, you know, historians are now talking about white subalternity, that even the Britishers, the whites were not, homogenous. There were subalterns within them. So this points to gender and class and race deviances and systems of differentiation and hierarchy within the colonizers. And now what we see is that feminists have also sought to produce a more nuanced and complex view of historical processes. They have, for example, talked about the double-edged implications of colonial law, and they have said that things were not as they seemed, that certain stereotypes continued to be invoked. But there are, while critiquing reforms and nationalism, gender historians have also come to recognize the potential and possibilities of these endeavors. So even, while we critique reformers, we need to realize that they were operating against various orthodoxies and conservatisms, and they were great liberal reformers and nationalist individuals. So women now, stress the importance of also avoiding this placement of women in an overarching category of women or viewing women as homogeneous entity. And so, again, to reiterate the point that I made earlier, that women, in spite of many limitations, were carving spaces for themselves, both in private and public domains. The customary demarcation of gendered spaces was actually becoming untenable, and disorder was creeping in the moral order in these turbulent times. So there is this very good collection by Sumit Sarkar and Tanika Sarkar, which is an anthology of women and social reforms. And that really highlights how women were increasingly taking initiatives and leadership in reforms, as well as enforcing openings into the male and public sphere of politics. So how women are entering these new arena. Now, I quickly want to talk about, the kind of new interventions that feminist contributions have made to anti-caste histories. So, for a long time, caste and gender were seen as different. They were seen as distinct categories. But both of them are actually forms of social difference and systems of inequality that have been, as I said, that need to be brought together. So, but for a long time, caste was seen as a uniquely Indian form of hierarchical stratification to be treated empirically, while gender was viewed as a universal conceptual category central to the reproduction of patriarchies. So, till about 2 decades back, feminist writings on colonial India largely focused, as I said, on representations of middle class, high caste women. But there has been an increasing focus on the role of caste and anti-caste movements, which underline the intersections between caste, gender, and patriarchy. So here I have in the slide, you can see some of the arguments that have been made by historians like Anupma Rao, Uma Chakravarti, Sharmila Rege, V. Geeta, S. Anandi, because they show how caste radicals, whether it is Phule, Ambedkar, or Periyar, they all are challenging connections between sexual regulation and caste reproduction. Even my work has, for example, highlighted the representations of Dalit women as vamp, victim, and virangana in the Hindi popular literature. And perhaps we can take some of this in the question answer session. Even the various essays in my edited volume have examined this close interaction between caste, gender, and community identities. If we look at the book by Lata Singh, and which I talked about earlier, Shashank Sinha and Lata Singh, what we see there also is that new vistas have opened that look at Adivasi women and their relationship to colonialism, the linkages between gender and labor, Also, very interesting work around women, medicine, and disease. So, for example, on Prostitutes, on Contagious Diseases Act, on the formation of lock hospitals, etc. And studies have also looked at the gender dynamics of migration. So I will now, in the brief time that I have, I think I have about 20 minutes. So, and I will now briefly touch on, some of these paradoxical gendered legacies of modern Indian history through sub-examples from my own work, which reveal not only how patriarchies were recast in more powerful, though subtle ways, but also how they were subverted or at least questioned in these periods. So, for example, one debate that I have looked in my first book was this debate around the purdah question. And what we see is that reformers are moving in a pendulum. So, Hindu reformers, while they are opposing purdah, they are, many of them are arguing that this is an invention, this came because of the Muslim rule, but they're also then selectively supporting it because they celebrate lajja as, women's, as Hindu women's best adornment. And also, as women are increasingly entering public spaces like railway stations, markets, participating in rallies, public ghats, they're visible on roads, they're interacting with others. So selective appearance of parda was actually argued that it was good for women themselves. So, for example, this is a quote from and my most of my examples are coming from the Hindi print public sphere because that is something that I'm much more familiar with. So, for example, one of the leading magazines of this time, Stree Darpan, which was actually very good. It had some really good articles on women's rights, etc. But it is also pointing as to how women, have constructed completely opposite meanings of parda. They observe it in homes, but in public sphere, they leave their faces uncovered. So it expressed disgust at public displays by women and finally upheld that true parda existed between Sita and Lakshman. There were also these kind of pictures and cartoons which again critiqued parda at home and what prevailed outside. So what these arguments do is they betrayed anxieties about women's behavior, movement, and relationships outside the household. Women bathing semi-nude in public ghats were seen as signs of shame, of being uncivilized, and a licensed misdoing in an open space. This was an antithesis of parda. To take another example, women were urged to observe parda at railway stations to escape the supposed lustful eyes of railway staff, passengers, and porters. So what we see is that the discourse on parda reveals an ambiguity, leading to simultaneous condemnation and endorsement. As reformers are afraid at times of the subversive potential of completely doing away with parda. It also parallels other attempts to control and isolate women at the same time to support reforms in order to appear civilized. Let me move to the example of women's education, which really appears high on the agenda of both missionaries and reformers. In pre-colonial India, educating women was largely frowned upon. It was even argued that if women were taught to read much more, they will become widows very early. There was this wide prevailing view. Literacy rates were very low. But British, particularly the missionaries, began effort to change this. And slowly the Indian reformist groups also adopted this campaign, giving it a native air of credibility. But we also need to see the language in which education for women was camouflaged, both for Hindu and Muslim women. So, for example, the work of Gail Mino highlights how this early generation of Muslim reformers like the Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Nazir Ahmad, Altaf Hussain Hali, they either argued that elite Sharif Muslim women should be educated within their homes, or even if they received education in schools, it was to be geared towards making them better companions and mothers. So in some ways, in 19th century and early 20th century, education for women was highly controlled by male perspective. There was this book which went into so many editions, for example, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi's Bihishti Zevar in 1905. through which he attempted a thoroughgoing Islamicization of Muslim women. And similarly, Hindu reformers were also asking women to be educated in Ramayana, Mahabharata, in religious texts, etc. There were also these kind of fears of, educating women, so that, it would lead to destruction of households, it would lead to deterioration in morals, it would, invade the privacy of homes, etc. So various newspapers, various articles, while promoting women's education, are also revealing this kind of anxieties, that are there. If you look at Annie Besant, again, one of the leading reformers, she's again saying that, girls' education had to be on national lines. It has to be, teach again to teach them to be better wives and mothers, to run the household in a better way, to, nurse the sick, and we don't need graduates, at this time. It was also argued that the effect of education on men was disastrous, and women, men were overburdened, and these men were also the way in which, clerical life of the Indian male was described, where he was a servant outside, but he was the master at home. Again, the kind of inside-outside distinction that Partha Chatterjee talks about, but there was this kind of distinction that was made. There was the appearance of a whole series of cartoons which expressed fears of who is this person who is, I think, spoiling the PowerPoint. I think there is somebody who is trying to draw on the PowerPoint. I request you to either get this person out or stop this kind of, what is happening. This is just for the organizers. Anyway, so this is some Kavita, I think, who's trying to do something with these PowerPoints. I don't know. Kavita Agarwal, I think. So please, Kavita Agarwal, I request you to stop defacing the cartoons. So what we see is that there was, whole series of cartoons which expressed fears of women getting educated. They poked fun at wives for having their husbands make tea, showing that this was a sign of a disaster. There was another cartoon which continued in the same vein. It's stating that the wife is writing a terrific note on the present state of women, and the godlike husband is looking after the child outside. And whoever laughs on seeing this natural scene, may God give him such a firebrand wife. So again, this kind of what we see is this kind of fear and anxiety regarding women's education. In particular, what we see is that the modern woman, was caricatured as an image of the Western Mem Sahib. There were articles, satire, songs, and cartoons that lampooned the modern educated woman while also revealing anxieties of men and patriarchal mindsets. So, for example, there were these poems which stated that such women would be like butterflies and that they would just watch theater, learn English, and also have intercaste, interreligious marriages. So there was, this kind of fear that also about conversions, that if women are educated, they would be marrying outside caste, outside religion, etc. So the dominant literary world also used visuals effectively to critique the modern woman. There was a set of cartoons published in this famous magazine Chand, which described the supposedly daily routine of a modern woman. So she was seen as just spending me time, time on herself. So she takes bath, she, decorates her hair, she then does makeup, then she goes to college, then she drives, then she listens to radio, she reads novels. And interestingly, it ends with the charkha, that she has no, and of course, charkha was also the symbolism of nationalism, and that she has no time to do household work. So there was this caricaturing again of the modern educated women. Another set of cartoons, for example, published in another magazine called Madhuri of this time, juxtapose this kind of traditional woman of a mythical past who was doing household work, taking care of children, performing puja, cleaning the household, drawing water, and then this modern woman who is just listening to music, playing badminton, riding a cycle, meeting men, listening to music, etc. So again, this kind of caricaturing and lampooning of the modern woman. Simultaneously, this was a time when there was a flooding of didactic and prescriptive literature in the market, geared towards making women ideal housewives and mothers, catering to the needs of all other family members. So, for example, one of the prescriptive texts argued that, the home is like this. Uh, the home is our school, and home is a temple in which we have to perform various duties. And basically, the main purpose of women's education is to increase morality. So, education for women was thus a moral imperative and a national investment designed to domesticate the woman and assign her more enlightened role for greater compatibility in marriage. So nowhere was education given such a moral fervor, a pure character, and a virtuous flavor as in the case of women's education. But then it is not enough to emphasize only the limits of educational avenues of women. So we see uh, that a study of education would be incomplete without drawing attention to levels other than the formal script. So many elite women like Azizun Nisa, Begums of Bhopal, Amma, Baby Ashraf of North India, educated themselves against all odds. Then there was Rashashundri Devi, again, Tanika Sarkar has written a whole book on her, an upper caste Bengali woman who taught herself to read and write in greater secrecy. She chronicled for the first time the life of a Hindu housewife and wrote perhaps the first recorded autobiography uh, printed in Bengali language by an Indian woman. It was called Amar Jeeban. It was written in 1876. There were some upper caste widows of Banaras, and Neeta Kumar has talked about it, who used education to reject stereotypes of widows and to manipulate the ascetic model uh, to carve out a space for themselves. So, as education blossomed, many middle class women used it to participate and become visible in the public sphere. They became editors of magazines, they wrote songs, they participated in political functions, and even if they are in a reformist mold, women's journals really created endless opportunities for women to argue for a voice of their own. Letters written by women in various women's magazines really stressed their right to feel and allowed a space for solidarity. So, in spite of limitations, there were so many dynamic women that emerged. I'm going to just talk about some of them. So, for example, Begum Rokia Hussain, she wrote this biting satire on patriarchy and its sanctity through religious practices. There was Himabati Sen, who was widowed at 10. She flouted social conventions and became one of the earliest women doctors. There was Rakma Bai, who fought this phenomenal battle against her husband. Again, she refused to go and live with her husband, and, a landmark battle she fought. And then, of course, there was, oh God, why am I not able to move my cursor? Oh, yeah. And then there was Pandita Ramabai of Maharashtra, a remarkable woman of her time. She was Brahmin by birth. She first created a stir in 1880 by marrying out of caste to a Bengali Shudra, so a Pratilom marriage. She became a widow at an early age and she was shunned by her community. Shortly afterwards, she converted to Christianity. She was determined to learn English and medicine. She traveled to England to do so. She wrote this book, The High Caste Hindu Woman, as a part of the effort to raise funds. This was an angry account of the harms of upper caste Hindu society. And she was really one of the most radical 19th century figures. She was also, of course, a pioneer in women's feminism, in women's rights. So we see a kind of proto-feminism and a language of rights being expressed at this time. And of course, we cannot forget Savitri Bai Phule, the great anti-caste reformer and educationist. In many ways, she was the equal of her husband, Jyotirao Phule, who was born in the Shudra caste of Malis. And Savitri Bai Phule wrote poetry, campaigned vigorously against caste inequity. In 1848, along with her husband, she established at Bhidewara, one of the earliest girls' schools, and many regard Savitri Bai Phule as the first Indian woman teacher. So no other Hindu social reformers of the 19th century led such a determinedly reformist conjugal life as Jyotiba Phule and Savitri Bai Phule. So even the reading habits of women actually in this period point to different directions. So while one could limit and frame syllabi and order prescriptive texts, once women were educated, it was difficult to control what they read and the uses to which they put their knowledge. So, for example, Yashoda Devi, though she was a remarkable woman in her own right, but she did lament that rather than reading books on religious education or household management, women much preferred reading juicy novels, stories, and songbooks. So, in many ways, print and education had revolutionized reading habits and possibilities and penetrated into all sorts of time and spaces within everyday life by its sheer portability. So, while education may have been intended to reinforce the power of the male over the female, it also empowered its female beneficiaries in ways unanticipated by the reformist patriarchs. And it created unpredictable but undeniable opportunities for some women. So, I'm just going to conclude my talk and say that there are many arenas where gendered perspectives can provide us with more nuanced and layered understanding of histories. So, gendered histories teach us to be innovative with our resources. They compel us to include, indeed, center materials that are often erased or elided in archival research. Pointing to erasures and silences in the archives and historical accounts, gendered histories teach us to read between the lines. They include archives of emotion, of memory as testimony, and they creatively use many other archives, autobiographies, letters, personal anecdotes. Moreover, I think gender histories not only discuss cataclysmic events from our pages of history, but they also focus on the mundane, the anecdotal, and the everyday. So they are much more about intimate spaces as they are about open ones. And in fact, they mess up these distinctions. And they also talk of gender not just as an autonomous entity, but as deeply intermeshed with caste, class, religious identities. Also, they probe femininities and masculinities. They interrogate the state and the community where British and Indian patriarchal forces sometimes colluded with each other. They were speaking in similar languages. So, in gender histories, both colonizers and the colonized actually emerge as actors and initiators. So they tell us not only how patriarchies found new expressions and languages in colonial India, but also how uh, they were constantly challenged and interrogated. Gender histories inspire us to come to terms with difference and conflict and live with such differences. They highlight the ambiguities and tensions of simultaneous operations of patriarchal norms and constant resistances of conservative dominations and assertions of freedom and sharing that constantly subvert patriarchies. And they offer us arenas of potential possibilities for imagining a better present and perhaps a better future as well. So I'm going to stop here, and I can take up questions and comments if needed.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah.
So thank you so much for such an enlightening talk in which you told they discuss the modern, the modern Indian perspective, that how gender has shaped the reality. You discuss some of the social reformers, some of the leading women figures, that how they created, a different perspective, or as far as education is concerned, or leading is concerned, Patni Taramabai and others, Rukaya Begum, Jyotiba Phule. I think, ma'am, we can address some of the questions that we are coming through chat box. So I'll tell you.
Okay. Let me just see. Can I see my chat box? Okay, let me just see. Let me.
It's disabled. Only I can see.
Okay, I cannot. Huh? Okay, fine. You
So
ask
I
me.
need the questions.
Um,
Okay, ma'am. So the first question is from Dr. Anjani Shankar. He's asking, are there any sources that express non-heterosexual stories of pleasure? Kindly, he would just want the name of the sources. And the
so,
other person is Agrani Shri. I think she wants to ask, writings on gender in modern India often draw retrospectively on the ancient past. She is curious to know if the developments in the study of gender in modern Indian history impacted studies on ancient history. Is it right to say that gender studies on ancient India have lagged behind modern India? Over to you, ma'am.
okay, so about non-heterosexual histories, if you want to look at, there are some sources. Of course, there is the work of Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai. There were also some stories that were written at this time, and I would urge you to read Tanika Sarkar's new book, Women and Religion, which touches upon some of these sources. For example, there was this very interesting story written, I'm forgetting the name, by a Bengali widow, and she was writing letters to this very dear woman with whom she became very close, and she addressed all those letters as Priyatam. And Priyatam, we know, is often used, to address your lover. And those letters were caught by her family, and they thought that she is having an affair, a love affair with a male, and she was killed by her family. And then this friend of hers revealed that actually those letters were addressed to her. Now, even if, this kind of non-heterosexual love is sometimes expressed in very muted forms, in very hidden forms, so that needs to be acknowledged. And of course, I have talked about it. There's this translation available. For example, there was this collection of stories called Chocolate, which was written by Pandey Bechen Sharma Ugr, which talked about homosexual relationships in public spaces, in parks, in jails, in libraries, and it is actually those stories were written in a very titillating fashion. They had story titles like Hum Fidaye Lucknow, Kamariya Nagan Sibal Khai, and they are talking of the wide prevalence of homosexuality actually. So there are some sources. If there's this much stories, there are some sources, but of course, I think it is very difficult. These are hidden histories. uh, Anjali Arondekar, for example, talks about this report which has vanished and from the archives, which was written by Richard Burton, which talked of the male brothels of Karachi. And again, the report has disappeared from the archives. And for her, it is interesting that why a particular report disappears. So she draws a history from the missing report, actually, of these male brothels. So again, I think one has to really dig up, but there are some sources. There was hardly any case actually that came under Section 377, during the colonial times. So that is why perhaps there are such few histories of same-sex desires written in colonial India. There are much more ubiquitous sources in the post-colonial period. Now, the second question about ancient past, see, the problem is about the sources. When we talk of ancient Indian history, we do have very rich sources for the elite classes, for studying the ruling classes, for studying, there are so many Sanskrit texts and there are so many voices that particularly are giving an elite perspective. They're written, they're mainly written by Brahmins and educated, very few classes. They're mainly addressed to them. And so the lives of the masses, of the common people are missing. And of course, there were exceptional women in ancient India. There is no denying that, but that is not the history of women. Or to take the scattered one or two examples and then to say that women were very liberated in ancient India, may not be really true, because as Uma Chakravarti has talked in a classic essay, Whatever Happened to the Vedic Dasi, that there were these large number of women who were slaves, and the condition of women was very much sometimes controlled. If you read a Manusmriti, or you know how kind of injunctions that were placed on women. So the sources, I think, are limited to study women in ancient India, especially the kind of non-elite women. And that is why there has been much more studies of women in modern India, of gender histories in modern India, though there are some brilliant works on ancient India as well. But I think because of the sources, I think that is a big hindrance. And also, I think the kind of efflorescence of we need to realize that women's studies and the contribution of gender in history has flourished along with and the activist movement, women's activism. So as the women's movement has grown, so has women's histories, the kind of emphasis on women's histories. So we have much, and as I said, 19th century was really a turning point when gender became the central subject. Questions of women became a central. Of course, there's much more when we look at the women's movement, when we look at this kind of 19th century turn, it's much more work on modern India compared to ancient India. But this is not to say, I think there is much more scope, but I think sources need to be excavated further for that period. While with the flourishing of print, with mass print cultures, we have quite a bit of sources for the modern period. I don't know if I've answered those questions, but yes.
We have two more questions. Just a boy is asking Tanmay that are there any referral in the primary sources regarding servant and master's sexual relationship between servant and master, especially in the colonial period?
Oh,
and
yes.
also one is someone is asking about gender sensitization. They want you to explain gender sensitization briefly.
So on servant master, there is a lot actually. There are these edited volumes too by Nitin Sinha and Nitin Verma, which is called Servants' Pasts. This has a very good collection, and I urge you to look at that. That will give you a starting point. But there is a lot of work on servants. I have also written actually two pieces on servants, and what we see is that there are great anxieties about this relationship between the mistress and the male servant, or even the kind of intimacies that emerge in between the woman mistress and the woman servant, that they can get. And so women mistresses are being told that they should keep away from their women servants, that they should just discuss with them work, and they should not become very close and intimate with them, or they are being told that to stay away from male servants, or to always observe purdah in front of them, not to laugh too loudly in front of them. So there are these kinds of anxieties, and some of the court cases also become very important. So for example, in many cases for the widows, rich widows, actually servants become their main confidants, and they are, fighting. They are going and collecting money for them. They are doing various kinds of, land owning, widows. The servants, they really rely on servants. So we get a lot of court cases as well. Court cases is like actually the space where you get servants' voices. So there are many court cases that come up. Nitin Verma has done this very good study on even cases of divorce, and servants' testimonies in these cases. So in various ways, you can cull a history, or for example, in British households, if you look at pre-1857 period, we get various examples of Britishers marrying, not marrying, also having mistresses or concubines from with their the servants, because pre-1857 very few white women were coming, and so race was not so explicitly stated as started happening post 1857 revolt. So you see many relationships forming, and there were many cases where such relationships were formed. Children were born after the whole Anglo-Indian community in some ways, and children were born, and then these children was taking claims over properties of the white male. He may have had a wife back home, and there are these kind of contentious debates around property. So there is work on that as well. So a lot of work actually has emerged in the past 10 years, 5 or 6 years mainly, on the servant master, servant mistress, also the kind of forced sexual encounters between, say, the upper caste male and the Dalit female servant, etc. So there are some sources. They need to be culled out, but if you look at images, people have scholars have looked at some of the books and photographs where servants are ubiquitous. If you look at even the collection of photographs, sometimes servants are ubiquitous. There are also different ways in which servant master relations are addressed. So, for example, in European households, they become very important from an earlier period, while in Indian households, because there's so much emphasis on women themselves doing household work, they become important later on. And even then, there are all these caste distinctions that if you want to employ a cook, it has to be an upper caste cook, etc. So I think it is a very interesting arena for even more work in this. So if you think it can be a very interesting topic for research as well. Gender sensitization, I think that's a very large topic and would require a separate lecture. But I think what everybody needs to realize is that a no means no. And while nobody is against consensual sexual relations or consensual encounters, I think what needs to be realized in very strong terms is that particularly universities are arenas which are expected to be much more democratic. But here also you see this kind of cases of sexual harassment, and there are very strict laws now and very strict formulations around that. And I think it's very important that there is a gender sensitization class held for all the newcomers in the colleges and universities. We also in our department try to hold a gender sensitization class. So I think a separate lecture would be needed for that.
So that's all, ma'am. Thank you so much for coming and delivering this lecture. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, thank you.